Shabbat Shalom. Why, we're quiet today. Try that again. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
That was a little more. I appreciate Greg's spirit and how he shared, and you can just sense the upbeat, the joy, and it's infectious. It's a real blessing. We're going to look at a story today in Genesis, the end of 27. And it's always amazing to me, and I'm sure all of us see this, that when you read the Bible, the stories in the Bible, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years old, speak to life today. And we're Genesis 27:30. Now it came about as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob. So last week, Jacob and Rebekah contrived to have Isaac bless Jacob and give him the firstborn, the birth blessing, and he'd already purchased the birthright. And Jacob had hardly gone out from the presence of Isaac his father. Esau his brother came in from hunting. Then he also made savory food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." Isaac his father said to him, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm your son, your firstborn Esau." Then Isaac trembled violently. And the way Hebrew, this is a good translation, but it's funny to me, and as I've learned a little Hebrew, and man, I don't know much, the way they emphasize things is they double the word. And so really what this says in Hebrew is it's more like violently, trembling. It gives you this sense that he didn't tremble. It was a very powerful sensation. He's very upset. And he said, "Who was he then that hunted game and brought it to me, so that I ate all of it before you came and blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed." When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." And he said, "Your brother came deceitfully, and has taken away your blessing." Then he said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. And you'll probably remember that Yaakov, Jacob, means he grasps the heel, that he's a supplanter, he's a deceiver, he's someone who cheats, is the way this could be seen. "He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." How many of you know that's not quite accurate? There's one of the things we'll notice, and I'll talk a little bit more about this today. I've always had kind of a negative view of Jacob because he's always helping God. He's always, and I've come to see that there's an attribute in that God loves. God loves people who participate with him. Now, we can overdo it, and as Greg reminded us, we don't want to do things in our flesh. But when you're in the story, you'll notice that Jacob is active and Esau is a victim. He's a victim of his impulses. He's a victim of his anger, his lust. He never takes control of himself or situations. Now, I don't like what Jacob and Rebekah did in this situation. I think they made some mistakes. But they saw a situation and they moved to do something. And God loves that. Jacob, I have loved. Esau, I have hated. And here's Jacob saying, "He took away my birthright." Wait a minute. You said, "What is my birthright to me? I'm hungry." He is a victim. And this is something that as I look through this passage and I look at myself, it's so important to find the delineation between waiting on God and being patient and being passive. Because when you look at history, when people are passive, horrible things happen. Because they say, "What can I do about it?" This is not godly. And you'll notice God rebukes Israel constantly when they just see bad stuff and they just sit back and watch it. Esau reminds me of this. He says, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" But Isaac replied to Esau, "Behold, I have made him your master, and all his relatives I have given to him as servants. And with grain and new wine I have sustained him. Now as for you then, what can I do, my son?" Esau said to his father, "Do you only have one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father." So Esau lifted his voice and wept. Then Isaac his father answered and said to him, "Behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall come about, when you become restless, that you will break his yoke from your neck." So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Now when the words of her elder son Esau were reported to Rebekah, she sent and called her younger son Jacob and said to him, "Behold, your brother Esau is consoling himself concerning you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, and arise, flee to Haran, to my brother Laban. Stay with him a few days until your brother's fury subsides, until your brother's anger against you subsides, and he forgets what you did to him. Then I will send and get you from there. Why should I be bereaved of you both in one day?" Speaking of Isaac and Jacob. Rebekah said to Isaac, "I'm tired of living because of the daughters of Het." That's Esau's wives. "If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Het, like these from the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me?" So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and from there take to yourself a wife from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May he also give you the blessing of Abraham, to you and to your descendants with you, that you may possess the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham." Then Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram, to Laban, son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, the mother of Jacob and Esau. Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob, and sent him away to Padan Aram to take to himself a wife from there, and that when he blessed him, he charged him, saying, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan," and that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother, and had gone to Padan Aram. So Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac, and Esau went to Ishmael and married, besides the wives that he had, Mahalat, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. Esau to me is he's a victim of his impulses. He's a victim of his life. And I got thinking about this, and there's so many ways to look at this story. But one of the things that came through to me that I've already mentioned is that while we might criticize Jacob and Rebekah, because in a certain sense they didn't have, Rebekah knew when she was carrying the boys in her womb that the older would serve the younger. She already knew that. And so the sleight of hand, the deception, cost them. In fact, she never saw Jacob again. When he left this time, that was the last time she ever saw him. But there is something in Jacob who sees what God has for him in terms of an inheritance, and he's constantly making positive motions. He's doing things to achieve that. And you know, Joy Dawson hated this analogy, but I can see value in it. And Gerald kind of alluded to this on the Day of Atonement. It's like a lot of things. You have to take it in balance. And she didn't like it when people would say, "You can't guide a parked car. Do something." She was so confident, and she would pray and then do what God told her. Some of us aren't quite as sensitive. And there, again, it's a fine line, but there's a place where you need to move. And I think one of the things that struck me as I was thinking about Jacob and Esau here, sometimes we clearly see what is right and wrong, but if we stand for the right, it will make waves. It will cause problems. And so it's easier to just stand back and say, well, that's too bad. And you'll notice that is not how Jacob lives his life. And God's constantly speaking to Jacob. God is not speaking to Esau. Because Esau is constantly doing what his impulses tell him to do, what his appetites. And I'll just point some things out to here that you already know, and it's why this is a difficult balance perhaps. And that is, God is the author of everything. And in Job says after Job had kind of been lecturing God on, I'm a good man, how could you let this happen to me? And so God talks to Job. I love that chapter because when he gets done, Job says, oh, I spoke of things too wonderful for me. Now I despise myself in dust and ashes. No plan of yours can be thwarted. In other words, all right, God, I'll shut up. Because God said, where were you when the earth was created? Where were you? And God asked him a whole bunch of questions, and Job's going, okay, all right. But no plan of God's can be thwarted. But here's the thing we might forget as human beings. Every plan of his is put into effect by people. He doesn't do things other way. He does it through people. There's a writing that says, without the flesh, the manifestation of God is not known to man. And I remember, and Randy's the one who brought this out, and it sent me back to the Bible because I knew he was right. But the children of Israel are told repeatedly that if they obey God's voice, he'll drive their enemies from the land. Exodus 23, if you truly obey his voice, God's voice, and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them. Who will destroy their enemies? God. Joshua 1. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, cross the Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you. Just as I spoke to Moses. Now wait a minute. Who's going to drive the people out? God. And how is he going to do it? You. Me. And I think this is what I think Jacob understands better than Esau. And I, again, God alone judges. I think Jacob overdoes it, but I was thinking about this and realizing that one of the things that happens to us as believers, and Greg alluded to this, and you brought it out too, Mary, that sometimes we forget that God is good and he's loving. Sometimes we don't understand it, but we live in that paradigm. When we step out of that paradigm, we disgrace ourselves and we betray God. And what's more, we end up not behaving in a way that tells the world that God is loving and that he's good. Go ahead, Greg.
There's a scripture that kind of highlights that in the New Testament, and I can't tell you which book it is, but the name of the Lord is blasphemed, and it uses that word blaspheme among the Gentiles
Because of you. No, it actually says that in the New Testament. It says that in the Old Testament.
And you think, all of the time, as you said, all the time that God says, if you'll be careful to observe my word, and it's kind of shocking to think of how many times did the children of Israel actually stop and listen to the word? Not very many times compared to the time that they decided to go on their own.
Yeah, and not only go on their own, here's the thing that struck me, is that sometimes it's so easy to forget that God has a wonderful plan for my life, for your life, for our lives, but that in a certain sense it hinges on obedience. It hinges on doing what he asks us to do. And sometimes he gives us a job to do, and we are destroyed in the process. And if we're worried about ourselves, we can end up being a hindrance to what God's going to do. And I'll give you some examples. Also, Numbers 33, you know this one. You shall inherit the land by lot according to your families. To the larger you shall give more inheritance. To the smaller you shall give less inheritance. Common sense. Big tribes, big place. Wherever the lot falls to anyone, that shall be his. You shall inherit according to the tribes of your fathers. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become as pricks in your eyes and as thorns in your sides. and they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you. I bring this out because God said he would drive out their enemies. Then he told Joshua, every place you put your foot. But then God says, I'm here to give you the strength to do this. But you must set your mind, set your heart to do what I've asked you to do. That the passive thing that hits us, see, when we hope in the Lord and we wait in the Lord, it's not passive. It's not apathy. And I think this is where sometimes as believers, and I'll bring up some more contemporary examples of this. However you would say it so you understand it the best, we participate with God in doing what he wants done. Many times, what Greg was talking about, the puzzle, sometimes we don't know what to do. And sometimes it's difficult to have the patience to hear what God is asking us to do. But the failure to be actively pursuing what God asks us to do means that something may not get done. And I think this is, sometimes people are so stuck on God's sovereignty, they miss the impact that our obedience and our choices make. Choose you this day whom you'll serve. Because you remember the story of Elisha when he was dying? And the king of Israel, and I've forgotten his name right now, came to Elisha to pay him tribute. And Elisha told him to take a bow and arrow and to strike the arrows on the ground. And he had let this king know that this was going to be a picture of God bringing victory for Israel over their enemies. And the king took the bow and arrow and struck it 3 times. And Elisha was furious with him. He said, God is giving this into your hand. This is up to you. And you chose 3 times. Why didn't you strike it 10? Why didn't you do something so I could destroy your enemies? You chose not to. And that just reminds me, we have an impact on what God's going to do. Jacob wants to participate with God to do what God's going to do. And I've been thinking about this a lot because one of the things that troubles me tremendously is that we have a world full of Christians, 2 billion, and still things go on and we do nothing. In fact, how many of you have ever heard this question, or the answer to this question? Why did the Holocaust happen? You know what I was told all the time growing up? The Holocaust happened because Jews didn't believe in Jesus. The Holocaust happened because Christians did nothing. The Holocaust is a judgment on the church, not on Jews. It's a judgment on those who sat by and watched it happen and did nothing. And God is judging the church, not the Jews. If you don't see that, it happens again. How did slavery exist in this country? A country that believed that God has sent his Son to die for us, to make us all equal. Neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek. How did it happen? If you don't wrestle with these kind of things, the scary thing is, will you do it again? You do it again. And I've been thinking about this, and I had this horrible, it was not a dream, it wasn't a vision, it was just an experience. You know the story when God comes to Cain? And he says, where's your brother? Remember Cain's answer? I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And God says, the blood of your brother is crying out to me from the ground. And I had this, it was like the Lord came to me and he said, where are the Jews? I don't know. Am I supposed to take care of the Jews? The blood of the Jews is crying out to me from the ground. And I had this awful sense that we who have been identified with the God of Abraham and given this brother, Judah, that we not only let him die, we participated. And I thought, never again, Lord, shall this happen to your people, that we will stand by and say, what can we do about it? Greg, did you have your hand up?
For me, that's why I think Isaiah 58 is so vital.
Absolutely. It's
just ringing with importance and pulsating with, please look at this, where it says that you don't fast just to deny yourself
right.
a pleasant meal or something like that. But if you fast and you don't break that yoke of oppression and the chains of injustice and look after your own people,
That's your own flesh and blood.
all's lost.
Yeah, the blessing comes in, like you said earlier today, in the connection, in the fellowship.
And if you don't do that, and I know how many times have we read Isaiah 58, and yet it is hopefully that the truth of that word will be implanted so strongly within us that we'll never forget that it's not a matter of speech. It's not a matter of cleverly devised arguments or anything like that. It's power.
Mm-hmm.
And the power is giving yourself to somebody else.
No, it's true, and I guess the thing that really has had me thinking about this is that there are a lot of things in our society today that tend to steer us into this idea that what I do or what I say has no impact. I even see in this election people saying it's rigged, or your votes don't count. And you realize, what's the impact of those statements? It's to get you to do nothing. And it's to think that just because I'm the only voice I think, then it's not worth it for me to do anything. And what happens? This becomes contagious, and it paralyzes an entire society. Don't ever let people sell you that. I was thinking about this. There's so many biblical examples that are examples in our day. But remember when Haman in the book of Esther put together this plot to kill all the Jews? And then Esther found out that Mordecai was going around weeping because she didn't know. She didn't know what Haman was doing. And she said, "Uncle, what's wrong? What?" And so he writes a little note and gives it to her. And he says, I'll read this to you, but the gist of this is, don't think this, you will escape this. And also, have you ever stopped to think that God has made you queen to do his bidding now? Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews." In other words, they're coming after the Jews. See, and I am not paranoid. But if you can't see that the times we live in, those who believe this is the truth, we could be in trouble. They could be coming after us. Now, am I worried about that? No. But I want to be ready to be obedient. I want to be ready to know I stand with the Lord. If that means I live, great. If that means I die, great, because he's great. Now, I want that decision made beforehand. I love what you said, Mary, because my heart broke when you said it. That if it's time for Finley to go home, are you still a good God? I've had that before. I couldn't answer yes at first. But he is a good God. And we come to that beforehand. We make that decision before to say he is a good God. His word is true. And I think that we live in a wonderful time, but we live in a very, it's a contentious, there are forces fighting in our world. And can you imagine being a Jew in the land? You're already you're in exile, and someone makes a decree that all your people are going to be killed, regardless of anything you ever did. But here's Mordecai. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Isn't that wonderful? Because Mordecai knows that God will take care of his people. And you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Then she told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, tell them to fast, Do not eat or drink for 3 days. I and my maidens will fast also. And this is when she prepared the plan that God gave her. But the thing that I think was so important in this is when they were faced with a tragedy, with something terrible, they didn't say, how can a great and loving God allow this to happen? They said, how can I be God's tool to fix this? How can I, and if it costs me my life, He's still good. And I think, a lot of things got me thinking about this, and I don't know how many of you are aware. I've spent quite a bit of time looking at the Holocaust because that's not that long ago, and I've always been amazed that loving, good Christians who went to church either did nothing or just averted their eyes. What Greg said today, out of sight, out of mind. That's how they handled it. And how could this happen? Because I think I told you about this story once before, but in March, well, it was at the end of February of 1943, the Gestapo arrested 10,000 Jews. All that remained in the city to make the city Judenfrei, which means free of Jews. And how many of you know that there are people that would like to have our country Christian fry? F-R-Y too. But between 1,700 and 2,000 intermarried Jewish men were included in the roundup. These were men who had wives who were German. There's something interesting in this story that I had missed before. I'm going to go into all the details, but these women went to the city center and protested. They were out there, thousands of them, and they dispersed them. They appeared in shifts throughout a week of protest, gathering in groups outside the guarded facilities. Efforts to disperse the crowd with threats of gunfire would temporarily clear the streets, but the women would return in strength. The visibility of the protests, which grew to as large as 600 people. What's 600 to 6 million? 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, but 600 wives out there saying, do not do this to our husbands. It was too much to ignore. The Nazi regime, obsessed with public image and conformity, feared that a crackdown on the protests would lead to more trouble and bad publicity. On March 6th, Joseph Goebbels, and if you know who he was, bad guy, ordered the release of the Jewish men. He rationalized it would be more efficient and less troublesome to delay the roundup of the remaining Jews until the difficult period following the German defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad. What I think is amazing about this is that the fact that somebody said, I don't care if you kill me, I'm standing up for what's right, and it stopped it. Do you have any idea what the world outcry was when we knew they were sending him to the ovens? When we knew that they were taking kids 6 and 7 and 8 and doing experiments on them. They were taking ovaries out of 8-year-old German girls and seeing the impact on them. They were freezing people by 1 degree at a time and carefully chronicling the body's response. They were doing stuff I'm not even going to tell you. It's so disgusting. And what did we do? That's too bad. It must be because they didn't accept Jesus. Why would they accept Jesus? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, why would they accept a Messiah that allowed 2 billion, well, we weren't 2 billion then, but all these people to stand by and watch this happen? Do you know that Jews have no reason to believe in him until we really follow him, until we look like him? And that just grabbed me. 600 people saved these men. But when all these others were dying, an interesting thing too, I'll just point this out. Of the Jews who survived the Holocaust, 98% of them were intermarried. In other words, they had a Gentile spouse. because somebody was standing up for them. Another story that grips me is the story about a LDS boy. His name is Hubener. I can't say his name. Now tell me somebody in the community right now that's 16. Is Emily 16? I was thinking she was 17. Okay, I think Emily is 17, isn't she?
Jamie will be 16 next summer.
Jamie will be, okay. Anyway, we're getting the idea of, is Megan?
In November. Yeah.
Okay, anyway, you get the idea. We're talking about Jamie, Emily, Megan. This is the age group, so you know what we're talking about. This young man, he belonged to the Church of Jesus Christ, as did his mother and grandparents. His adoptive father, Hugo, gave him the name Hubener. That was his last name. He had since early childhood, been a member of the Boy Scouts, which is a very common thing for Mormon boys. It was strongly supported by his church, but in 1935, the Nazis banned scouting from Germany. So he joined the Hitler Youth because it was required by the government. But he disapproved of Kristallnacht. Do you know what this was? Kristallnacht is when the Germans went through the streets, breaking the windows, destroying all the Jewish businesses, plundering them, attacking the people, and most of Germany stood by and said nothing. But this young man, he didn't approve of it. When one of the leaders in his local congregation, a new convert of under 2 years, undertook to bar Jews from attending its religious services. Now this happened in almost every church. That in order to be in concert with the Nazi government, not get in trouble, they banned Jews from coming to their services. Can you understand how there's something really rotten when we step back and say, well, God better do something about this situation, because like Esther, that might be why you are in that situation. So he found himself at odds with some of the new policies, but he continued to attend services with like-minded friends as the Latter-day Saints debated the issue. After he finished middle school in 41, so he'd be very young. In 41, he would have been 15, I think. He began an apprenticeship in administration at the Hamburg Social Authority. He met other apprentices there, one of whom, what's that?
That's a great Hamburg Social Authority.
He met other apprentices there, one of whom, Gerhard Duer, he would later recruit into his resistance movement. At a bathhouse, he met new friends, one of whom had a communist family background, and as a result, this is the thing that really started to steer him down the wrong road. He started to listen to enemy radio broadcasts. Now, what he found out when he started listening to the radio, and he was listening to, what was it called? It might be in here. It was radio from Britain, BBC. He discovered that what they were telling him, what the Nazi government was telling the Germans, wasn't true. If you remember, by this time already, they were starting to encounter some severe defeats. But all they were hearing was this great, glorious Nazi regime was sailing forth and was going to conquer the world, and all was well. He started to find out that wasn't true. And he started to distribute leaflets that told people how skewed the official reports were, and as well to point out Adolf Hitler's shortcomings, Joseph Goebbels, and even started to point out the criminal behavior. He also started to point out that the war was futile and it would end in Germany's defeat and destruction. Now here, this is a 15, 16-year-old kid that's doing this. In 41, late 41, he managed to involve 3 friends in his listening: Karl Heinz, Rudy, and Gerhard. He had them help him distribute 60 different pamphlets, all containing typewritten material from the British broadcast. That's where he was getting his information. He distributed these throughout Hamburg using methods as pinning them on bulletin boards, inserting them into letter boxes, and stuffing them in coat pockets. Now, here's the thing I love about this. What he's doing is hopeless. He hasn't got a chance. But it's the right thing to do. February 5th, 1942. It's Kevin's birthday, isn't it? Or is he the 4th? Anyway, he was arrested by the Gestapo at his workplace. While trying to translate the pamphlets into French and have them distributed among prisoners of war, he had been noticed by the Nazi Party. August 11th, 1942, his case was tried at the, I'm not going to say that name, Volksgericht, and he was sentenced to death. After the sentence was read, he faced the judges and said, "Now I must die, even though I have committed no crime. So now it's my turn, but your turn will come." This kid is 16. He's Mormon. 2 months later, on 27th of October, he turned 17. He was beheaded by a guillotine. His two friends who had been arrested were given prison sentences, and they were able to, they made it through the war. I don't know how many of you knew about that story, but yeah, and the interesting thing is they didn't tell him of the decision, of the actual schedule, when he was going to be executed until 1 o'clock on the day of his execution. He was beheaded at 8:13. And I wanted to bring him up because I think we need people like that to remind us that even when it looks futile, when it looks like it won't accomplish anything, it's worth it to stand up for what's right. How many of you know who the Ten Booms are? Corrie Ten Boom, her sister, her dad. Why were they so different from anybody else? Do you realize that they arrested them because they were hiding Jews and then helping them escape? And when they arrested them, her dad was an old man. And after the arrest, the German officials came to her dad and they said, "Papa, we don't want to put you in prison. All you have to do is renounce what you've been doing to the Jews, and you're out of here." This old man says, "No, what I was doing was right. I'm not changing." He died within a month. He was an old man thrown in. And here's the thing. Why did he do that? Because it was right. Because God, see, this is the thing that I think has been kind of motivating me as I've looked at this and looked at this chapter. Let's not forget that God does things through people. That doing the right thing, even if it looks like there's nobody with us, will always be right. And we are all blessed to look back on Hubener and the Ten Booms and Oskar Schindler and the others that did the right thing. And the story of the Exodus. Oh, how many of you know about the St. Louis? This is a ship that came to Cuba and America in 1939. Had 908 Jews on it. They had legal visas to enter Cuba. They did not let them off the boat. So they sent them back to Europe, where most of them died in the gas chambers. That ship, the Exodus, and I don't really know that's the story that Leon Uris put together, but the actual ship, the Exodus, was not allowed to dock in Israel with all these, almost everybody on the ship was a Holocaust survivor. This is in 1947. They said, "You don't have legal visas to enter Palestine." They sent them back to Europe. And I think we should be legal, but I think we need to be careful. How many of you remember the story of the Egyptian midwives? What was their job? What were they to do with Hebrew baby boys? But they wouldn't. So what did God do about their illegal action? He blessed them with families of their own. I believe in keeping the law, but I think one of the things we need to understand, the society, we may enter a time now when there's a choice between obeying God and man. It's better to obey God. It's better to stand for justice. And it's also important, I think, to remember that God works through people. That the way he changes society is he raises up men and women who are obedient. And I mentioned to you earlier, one of the things I see in this present election is the hopelessness and futility that people are feeling. Don't go there. Your vote counts. Vote for the person you think is the best. Anybody that convinces you that the system is rigged, well, I look at the choices sometimes and it's like Utah's execution method. You can choose shooting or hanging. That's kind of what it feels like. But the hopelessness is something that doesn't come from the Lord. And here's the thing. Do any of us have any idea what God's plan for this country is? No, but will God's plan be good? Will God intend? And I'll tell you something right now. This is letting my politics leak in here a little bit. I don't want any part of any government that's not here to bless the nation of Israel. When we bless the nation of Israel, then we become the true Christians and believers that we are. We identify ourselves as Ephraim, and we're part of that house. It's not to condemn anyone else. Yeah, how many of you saw what came out of UNESCO yesterday? The United Nations, they voted to change all the terminology describing the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, to Muslim names, and denied any Jewish connection. Netanyahu, I had to laugh what he said. He said, this is like saying that the Great Wall of China has nothing to do with China or the pyramids have nothing to do with Egypt. But we did it because there's something evil at work here. I want to finish with this. It's time to stop. I was thinking about this and thinking, Lord, stay helpful. And I mentioned to him, Greg, I don't know if you're in here. You stepped out for a minute. I appreciate that you get up every week and you make me feel positive. You make me feel like serving the Lord is a good thing. You make me feel like it's a new day, it's a good thing, God's speaking to us, and Yeshua, Jesus, is alive. I appreciate it. I need that. That's wonderful. Psalm 2. Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? Does that sound like today? The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Yeah? Let us tear their fetters apart and cast their cords away from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Amen. Let's all stand. Sister Teresa, would you close for us, please?